Their subterranean city of terror, and there are hundreds of kilometers of terror tunnels, billions and billions of dollars. How many schools, how many hospitals, how many power plants could have been built in Gaza if all funds, UN funds, were not diverted to terror? This council must also not remain silent about the Shiite elephant in the room. Iran armed, Iran funded, Iran trained Hamas. But the Ayatollah regime's central role in the ruin of the region has not even been addressed here. It's not as if Hamas is fighting Israel alone. Hezbollah missiles have been raining down on northern Israeli towns, and Iran doesn't hide its aim of Israel's destruction. Iran publicly supports the October 7th massacre, what started everything. Does Iran's central role in destabilizing the security of the Middle East not deserve to even be raised here? It is clear that the UN has been co-opted by those that have no real interest in a solution. Every UN body has been weaponized against Israel. Today we will be hearing from some foreign ministers of countries that have not even condemned Hamas's massacre. Can we honestly expect them to provide a productive option? The only input that can be valued here is from parties that have condemned Hamas's massacre. This is the basic thing. This should be the bare minimum. Just look at what has been taking place at the UN over the past week. UN briefers from UNICEF did not even bother to mention Hamas's indoctrination of Gazan children to terror. UN Women did not brief the Council on the savage rape and sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas against Israeli women. And this entire week has been dedicated only to Palestinian solidarity.
First time, supplies of cooking gas entered Gaza, where people waited in lines that extended for 2 kilometers. In the south, where the needs are dire, UN agencies and partners have increased both the amount of aid delivery and the number of locations reached. And I express my appreciation to the government of Egypt for their contribution in making this assistance possible. But the level of aid to Palestinians in Gaza remains completely inadequate to meet the huge needs of more than 2 million people. And although the total volume of fuel allowed into Gaza has also increased, it remains utterly insufficient to sustain basic operations. Civilians in Gaza need a continuous flow of life-saving humanitarian aid and fuel into and across the area. Safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all those in need is critical. Humanitarian partners carried out several medical evacuations from North to South Gaza, including to transport dozens of premature babies, as well as spinal and dialysis patients from Shifa and Al-Ahli Anglican hospitals. Several critically ill patients have also been evacuated for treatment in Egypt. Hospitals across Gaza lack the basic supplies, staff and fuel to deliver primary health care at the scale needed, let alone safely treat urgent cases. The medical system has broken down under the heavy caseload, acute shortages, and the impact of hostilities. Mr. President, Security Council Resolution 2712 calls for, and I quote, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. The arrangements announced on 22 November has so far led to the release over 5 days of 60 hostages, 29 women, 31 children, held by Hamas and other groups since 7 October. Outside the arrangement during the same period, another 21 hostages were released. This is a welcome start, but as I have been saying from day one, all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Until then, they must be treated humanely, and the International Committee of the Red Cross must be allowed to visit them. The arrangement also saw the release of 180 Palestinian prisoners and detainees from Israeli jails, mostly women and children. Mr. President, Security Council Resolution 2712, and I quote, calls on all parties to refrain from depriving the civilian population in the Gaza Strip of basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to their survival, consistent with international humanitarian law. Much more is required to begin to address human needs in Gaza. Water and electricity services must be fully restored. Food systems have collapsed and hunger is spreading, particularly in the north. Sanitary conditions in shelters are appalling, with few toilets and sewage flooding posing a serious threat to public health. Children, pregnant women, older people and those with weakened immune systems are at greater risk. Gaza needs an immediate and sustained increase in humanitarian aid, including food, water, fuel, blankets, medicines and healthcare supplies. It is important to recognize that the Rafah border crossing does not have enough capacity, especially taking into account the slow pace of security procedures. That is why we have been urging the opening of other crossings, including Kerem Shalom, and the streamlining of inspection mechanisms to allow for the necessary increase of life-saving aid. But humanitarian aid alone will not be sufficient. We also need the private sector to bring in critical basic commodities to replenish completely depleted shops in Gaza. Mr. President, finally, Security Council Resolution 2712, and I quote, underscores the importance of coordination, humanitarian notification and deconfliction mechanisms to protect all medical and humanitarian staff, vehicles including ambulances, humanitarian sites and critical infrastructure, including UN facilities. A humanitarian notification system is now in place and is being constantly reviewed and enhanced, including through plans for additional civil-military experts to support coordination. Mr. President, I welcome the adoption of Resolution 2712, but its implementation by the partners matters most. In accordance with the resolution, I will revert to the President of the Security Council with a set of options on effectively monitoring the implementation of the resolution. I have already established a working group composed of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Department of Peace Operations, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the Office of Legal Affairs to urgently prepare proposals in this regard. So far, it is clear that implementation has been only partial at best, and it was woefully insufficient. Ultimately, we know that the measure of success will not be the number of trucks dispatched or the tons of supplies delivered, as important as these are. Success will be measured in lives that are saved, suffering that is ended, and open dignity that is restored. The people of Gaza are in the midst of an epic humanitarian catastrophe before the eyes of the world. We must not look away. Intense negotiations are taking place to prolong the truce, which we strongly welcome, but we believe we need a true humanitarian ceasefire. And we must ensure the people of the region finally have a horizon of hope by moving in a determined and irreversible way towards establishing a two-state solution on the basis of United Nations resolutions and international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. Failure will condemn the Palestinians, Israelis, the region and the world to a never-ending cycle of death and destruction, and I thank you.
感谢秘书长的发言。
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing.
请温尼
I now
斯
give
兰
the
德先
floor to
生
Mr.
应
Tor
道。
Wennesland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, members of the Security Council. Following the Secretary General's statement, I will focus my briefing on dynamics in the occupied West Bank, the region, and where we go from here in the context of the unfolding conflict between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza. Before doing so, I wish to join the Secretary Generals in acknowledging the efforts of Qatar, Egypt and US in facilitating an agreement that has secured the release of 60 Israeli hostages from Gaza so far, resulted in a 6-stage pause in fighting, which allowed UN to scale up humanitarian aid, as well as led to the release of 180 Palestinian prisoners and detainees from Israeli custody. Such respite from weeks of horror is long overdue. Mr. President, while the world's attention has been rightly focused on the devastating violence and outbreaks of hostilities since 7 October, we are also witnessing a heightened tension, intensive violence and widespread movement restrictions across the occupied West Bank. The period has been marked by some of the most intensive Israeli operations in the West Bank since the Second Intifada, involving the use of improvised explosive devices by armed Palestinians and drone strikes by Israeli security forces. Tulkarem and Jenin have seen the largest-scale Israeli operations, including inside the refugee camps. Settler violence has also continued at high levels, driving mounting tension and increased violence, as well as Palestinian displacement. In all, 154 Palestinians, including 37 children, have been killed this reporting period in the West Bank. Nearly all of them in the context of Israeli operations, many involving armed exchanges with Palestinians. 2 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli settlers. 3 Israelis, including 2 security forces, were killed by Palestinian attacks. Mr. President, amid the surging violence and extensive Israeli movement restriction, the Palestinian Authority's long-standing fiscal crisis have worsened significantly as economic activity in the West Bank has grown to a halt and the economy of Gaza collapsed. The 2nd November decision by the Israeli Security Cabinet to deduct, quote, all funds designed for Gaza Strip, unquote, from the clearance revenue Israeli transferred to the PA further weakened revenue, impacting many critical services and the payment of public sector salaries, including to the security forces. The situation is boiling and getting worse rapidly. In the months before the war, I warned regularly in this council that more must be done to help stabilize the situation in the West Bank. That is more the case now than ever before. Mr. President, a few words on the regional dynamics and my continued concern about the risk for further escalation. Turning to Israel's north, while tension along the blue line have calmed in recent days, the situation remains volatile, and it was through the reporting period. Approximately 100,000 Israelis remain displaced from communities in the north, and some 50,000 Lebanese are displaced from southern areas near the blue line. On the Golan, firing from Syria towards the Israeli-occupied Golan and strikes by Israelis against targets in Syria took place. From further afield, missiles and drones were also reportedly launched from Yemen towards Israel. Most were intercepted. However, drone strikes claimed by the Houthis hit a school in Eilat on 9 November. A ship affiliated to an Israeli businessman was seized by Houthis forces in the Red Sea on 19 November. Mr. President, the dizzying pace of events and staggering needs on the ground make it difficult to see beyond the most immediate challenges. Nevertheless, we must begin work on what comes next. Without an effective political and security framework for when the fighting ceases, it will be impossible to sustainably end the violence and shape a new reality. Over the coming weeks and months, the international community must increase their engagement with Israel, the PA and regional partners for constructive and practical political solutions. While much is unknown about how this war will end, some absolutes are clear. Acts of terror, like those Hamas and others committed against Israel on October 7th, must never be allowed to happen again. And Palestinians in Gaza must never ever again experience the horrors they have endured. Gaza is and must remain an integral part of a future Palestinian state, with both Gaza and West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. The only viable path is one that leads to an end of the occupation and the realization of a two-state solution in line with UN resolutions, previous agreements, and international law. Our past efforts have certainly not been enough. A message that resonates in particular today as we mark the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. There must be a new and different approach, or we are doomed to return to the path of managing a conflict that clearly cannot be managed. Thank you.
OK。非常感谢
Thank you,
威尼斯兰先
Mr.
生
Winnisland.
通报。我现在请观察员国
I now give the
巴
floor
勒斯坦外交
to His Excellency Mr. Riyad Al-Maliki, Minister of Foreign Affairs Expatriates of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I thank you for your decision to hold this meeting at ministerial level and for sharing it. I thank all the ministers who decided to attend, and notably the Arab and OIC ministers who have been touring the world to advocate for an end of the Israeli aggression. I also wish to thank the Secretary General for his briefing and his efforts, and the United Nations for their vital role on the ground. Mr. President, Khalid, a grandfather, held his 3-year-old granddaughter, Reem, smiling at her, kissing her, saying comforting words to her, opening her eyes repeatedly, calling her the soul of my soul, just before laying her and her 5-year-old brother, Tariq, to rest. So many lives turned into names on plastic bags, leaving this earth way too early and in the most brutal way. And so many shattered lives and bodies are yet to be given the chance to mourn and heal to the extent possible after such tragedies and pain. Anyone still not sure they are against what is happening or that it needs to end should check their humanity. Life in Gaza must prevail over those who aim to destroy it or uproot it. We thank Qatar and Egypt for their efforts that led to a truce. But a truce must become a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire.
From
The
Shifa
massacres cannot
and
be allowed
Al-Hali
to resume.
Anglican hospitals.
This is not a war.
Several critically
This is a
ill
carnage
patients
that
have
nothing
also been
and no one
evacuated
can
for
justify. It must be brought to an end. Mr. President, we had said early on that the humanitarian catastrophe cannot be prevented. People held captive cannot be released. Regional escalation cannot be avoided without a stop to the Israeli assault against the Palestinian people in Gaza. What we see now confirms what we have said then. Thousands of lives could have been spared. The momentum we are finally witnessing now must be sustained. Families must be reunited in life, not in death. The dire needs of our people in Gaza must be addressed throughout the Gaza Strip without further delay and constraints. People must be allowed to go back to their homes and start rebuilding their lives. The siege imposed by Israel must be lifted. Mr. President, over 15,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel. Over 10,000 of them are women and children. They have been killed by Israel. They did not lose their lives. It was taken away. No one is safe in Gaza. not the children, not the doctors, not the humanitarian personnel, not the journalists, not the UN staff. They were killed at an unprecedented pace in modern history. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. Not the north, not the south, not UN shelters, not schools, not hospitals, not ambulances, not homes, not streets, not mosques, not churches. People were being killed everywhere. International humanitarian law was enacted to protect these people and these places. And instead of being spared, they were targeted. Israel keeps giving examples from the Second World War to justify its crimes, ignoring that it is the very horrors that occurred then that led humanity to enact the fundamental rules Israel is breaching now. How many times can the world afford to fail the test of humanity in Gaza, in Palestine? How many times can it afford to fail the test of legality? Mr. President, we are at a historic crossroad, and we are out of time. A solvable political conflict is being turned into a never-ending religious confrontation. Our people are faced with an existential threat. Make no mistake about it. With all the talk about the destruction of Israel, it is Palestine that is facing a plan to destroy it. Implemented in broad daylight, enacted in laws and in policies, carried out with brutality by soldiers and by settlers. We are being erased from the map, literally. Netanyahu, from the podium of the General Assembly, announced a new Middle East where Palestine had vanished. It is no coincidence that in the map he raised at this occasion, both the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip were considered part of Israel, alongside the Syrian Golan. We are being pushed out of history and geography. Israel calls it voluntary resettlement. They are just suggesting it for our own sake. With siege and bombs that have led to the displacement of 1.7 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and with incursions and attacks by occupation forces and settlers. They have turned Gaza into hell on earth, and the lives of Palestinian communities in the West Bank into a living hell. On the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, they are trying to finish the job. 75 years later, Israel should rather be convinced that no force on earth can uproot Palestinians from Palestine, nor Palestine from the hearts of Palestinians, wherever they are. The Palestinian people are here to stay. They are from this land and of this land, and their destiny is to live in freedom and dignity on this land. Isn't it time we found a way to live side by side? We don't even need to search that hard for that way. It is enshrined in international law and the relevant UN resolutions. The fulfillment of the Palestinian people's inalienable rights and two states living side by side in peace and security on the pre-1967 borders. Mr. President, there are calls to avoid escalation in the West Bank, but the escalation is there. Since the 7th of October, over 230 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. 3,200 have been injured. 1,250 have been displaced, including 500 children. Thousands have been arrested, maimed, humiliated, harassed. So escalation is there. Or does it only become an escalation if Israelis are harmed? We know the entire world rejects Israel's colonial policies and violence and has been calling for accountability. But that accountability cannot come from a government whose agenda is the settlers' agenda, led by settlers, funding settlements, arming settlers, and the protection of our people cannot be ensured by the occupying forces who are complicit in these crimes. We need international protection and international action to end impunity so as to prevent the recurrence of these crimes that occur daily and in broad daylight. What our people are enduring now is the result of the international community's failure to provide such protection and accountability. Mr. President, Israel kills our children one generation after another. Today in Jenin, Israel killed 2 Palestinian children, gunned down by Israeli snipers. Adam, 8 years old, was shot in the head, and Basil, 15 years old, was shot in the chest. Israel maims our children one generation after another. Israel arbitrarily arrests our children one generation after another. As you feel relief to see those held captive in Gaza reunited with their loved ones, don't feel shame if you have the same feeling when you see a Palestinian mother reunited with her released son. Feel shame if you don't. Israel calls our children terrorists to justify killing them, arresting them, torturing them. They arrest them from their homes, from their beds, before dawn, traumatizing them and their families every day of every year. That must stop. The dehumanization and demonization of Palestinians have reached such depth, some could still wonder if there was not some explanation for flattening entire neighborhoods, leaving thousands under the rubble. Children, women, elderly, men killed indiscriminately and with total disregard for every legal rule and every human value. This dehumanization has consequences far beyond our borders, including here. It led to the stabbing of a 6-year-old and the shooting of 3 university students in the United States. Israel targets our children and then says we teach them hatred. The problem is not that our children are fed falsehoods, but that they are fed bombs and bullets, occupation and oppression, blockade and walls. We will confront those who try to justify the killing of our children and all those promoting double standards in the physical world or the virtual one, trying to silence those who convey their truth from under the bombs and those who stand in solidarity with Palestine. Israel believes there is an international law specific to it, designed to be compatible with their crimes. An international law that allows war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, an international law that applies not based on its actions, but on the identity of the perpetrator and the identity of the victim. Our stance remains unchanged. Vengeance is never the answer. Justice is. Our people should not be denied justice any further. The lives of Palestinians are not less sacred than the lives of any other people on earth. Justice will help us chart a path where no Palestinians and no Israelis are killed. Mr. President, Israel is trying to intimidate those criticizing it and defending the rule of international law across the globe, including governments that consider themselves allies of Israel, the Secretary General and the UN agencies, human rights and humanitarian organizations. It also did not stop its undermining of the Palestinian National Authority on the political, financial, and security levels, nor its attacks against the Palestinian people as a whole. Israel is never to blame. Everything else is, starting with the Palestinians, of course. We are responsible for our own disposition, for our forcible displacement, for the occupation of our land, for the killing and maiming of our people, for the oppression and subjugation we are victims of. None of it is Israel's fault. Even as its leaders confess to their crimes, deny the very existence of our people, and pledge to spare no effort to prevent the independence of our state, they tell you that the obstacle to peace is not them. They are most than willing to make peace once we are dead or displaced, of course. Mr. President, we are a nation, and we have earned respect as a nation. The respect and solidarity of peoples around the world that is manifesting itself yet again these days, including on this International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. We are human beings, and we are owed respect to our inherent dignity as human beings. No one should dare to justify the killing of Palestinian civilians. Israel has no right to self-defense against the people it occupies, and that it is obligated to protect under international law. Israel has no right to security that trumps our right to life, to freedom, and self-determination. Israel is not seeking security. If it was, it would choose peace